see it round the right way. Is that right, Pak Yanuar?
Yeah.
Okay.
The video background is fine.
It's like a daguerreotype. A daguerreotype, the first form of photography. Yeah, it was always mirror reversed. Yeah.
Halo Romo Ageng, Pak Bobby.
Good afternoon, Pak Yudo,
Hi, Bobby.
ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, this is Pak Bobby.
Yeah.
Hello.
The video background is fine.
Like a daguerreotype. A daguerreotype, first form of photography. Yeah, it was always mirror reversed.
Halo Romo Ageng, Pak Bobby.
Selamat siang, Yudo,
Selamat siang.
ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, this is Pak Bobby.
Hello, gentlemen. I just want to say hello.
Hello, Harold.
Hi,
Oh, I like-
Harold.
Hi,
I like your hat. Nice hat, yeah?
Yes, yes, indeed. Oh, yeah, you can see my hat on. I forgot. That's right. Yes. So, all good luck with the podcast. And I understand, Scott, you've reached the ripe age of independence. Let's put it like that.
Retirement. Yes, I retired 2 days ago. I'm now an old retired man. Yeah, I retired 2 days ago. So,
I hope you join that club quite soon as well, actually.
well, don't rush into it too soon. I'm not sure it's to be recommended or not. Yeah, so
You want to tell me? Fantastic.
I'd say wait a few months first. I'll give you my verdict. Yeah.
Good. Yeah. Well, I got some time anyway to before I get there. So, but I just want to wish you good luck with the podcast and congratulations on the book. It looks really fantastic, and I got a couple of copies of it, and actually some of them go to my friends and family in the Netherlands.
Thank you very much, Harold, for buying them all the way from Hong Kong. I heard you did that, and I'm very touched that you would do that. And thank you very much. And I hope your friends and family in the Netherlands find something in the book which they can relate to and which they like. Yeah. And thank you very much.
Yeah,
I
no,
appreciate
they
it.
got your other books as well, so they will love it.
Mm.
I'm planning to carry it to them over the summer, so let's hope travel comes back. Otherwise, it's going to be DHL.
Yes, let's really hope travel comes back. I don't think it'll come back in Australia for a while. Our vaccine program is running behind schedule, so I don't think any of us will be traveling overseas again till next year at the earliest. Yeah. Mm.
Well, Javanese mountains don't walk away, so hopefully, as long as we can go and climb a few of them in time. then,
Yeah, fingers crossed. Gunung Sumbing and Gunung Merbabu will still be there next year. Yeah, so with a bit of luck, they might be, Harold, and we can climb them together. Yeah.
absolutely. I'm looking forward to that.
Of course,
Anyway,
Pak
up to my
Bobby
video
is
stop. Cheers.
there.
But you know,
Sorry, Pajudo.
Yes, of course, Merbabu, Merapi, and Sumbing is still be there in Central
Yes.
Java.
Yeah. Certainly,
we're gone.
certainly hope so. Certainly hope so. Mm, mm.
Okay, I'm putting my video on off. So see you. Cheers, eh?
Thank you, Harold.
Selamat sore, Pak Hilmar Farid.
Selamat sore.
Selamat sore, Pak Hilmar.
Selamat sore semuanya.
Selamat sore, Pak
Yudo, apa
Hilmar.
kabar?
Oh, baik, Pak Hilmar.
Hai,
Terima kasih untuk kedatangan siang ini, Pak.
sama-sama. Iya, iya.
Terima kasih, Pak Hilmar.
Terima kasih juga bukunya.
Ya, itu
Saya sudah terima. Ya.
Oke, Mbak Puspa, mungkin bisa kita mulai?
Okay, yeah. Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Peripul's Talk. Okay. We are still waiting for the others join the meeting. Please wait, the discussion will be begin soon.
Langsung kita mulai aja, Mbak Puspa, nggak apa-apa.
Yeah, okay.
Langsung aja.
Thank you for finding time and joining online book discussion with Periplus. First, let me introduce myself, Puspa Effendi. I'll be responsible for hosting this online book discussion. Today, we have special offer with 10% discount for all the books by Scott Merrillees and History Book of Jakarta, and the link will be provided on the Zoom chat. We will give only 3 vouchers for the best questioner in Q&A session. Okay. Okay. The Honorable Mr. Hilmar Farid as our keynote speaker. He is a Director General of Culture, Ministry of Education and Culture. We also have a talented journalist as our moderator, Miss Steffi Emilia. She is a former senior editor at Jakarta Post. The special guest that we are waiting for, Mr. Scott Merrillees. He is a leading author and historian. He has written 4 books. The first is Batavia in 19th Century Photographs. The second is Greeting from Jakarta. The third, Jakarta. And the fourth, Faces of Indonesia, which is our topic discussion today. The fourth book is Faces of Indonesia, 500 postcards from 1900 to 1945. This book brings to bear an early pictures, postcards, and photographs. It is also explore the rich and fascinating history of Indonesia, and also to highlight the remarkable diversity among the people of Indonesia, even before Indonesia Independence Day was declared. Before we begin, please allow me to remind you to write your real name in the Zoom profile name, and please mute your own microphone. And if you have any question, please write them through the chat box. The moderator will be read and choose the question during Q&A session. The book Faces of Indonesia is now available at Periplus Bookstore and periplus.com. We have special discount 10% off for Scott's book and history theme of Jakarta book. The information and link will be posted in the chat box. Okay, and now, Miss Steffi, the floor is yours.
Baik, terima kasih Puspa. Sekali lagi selamat datang untuk semua peserta, untuk Pak Hilmar dan juga Pak Scott. Selanjutnya sebelum kita memasuki presentasi dari Pak Scott, kita akan mendengar opening speech dari Pak Hilmar dulu. Please, Pak Hilmar.
Baik, terima kasih Bu Steffi dan selamat sore semua Bapak Ibu. Saya terima bukunya beberapa waktu lalu dan sangat terkesan. Ini buku yang luar biasa, Faces of Indonesia, dan ini menggunakan banyak materi yang belum pernah dipublikasikan sebelumnya. Dan ini mengingatkan saya pada satu pekerjaan riset beberapa tahun yang lalu di Leiden University. Kebetulan ada seorang sejarawan senior, Gene Taylor, dia menulis buku tentang Indonesia, sejarah yang dan dia waktu itu membuat kajian mengenai foto sebagai bahan sejarah. Dan dalam buku Pak Scott ini kita diberi 500 image postcard yang sangat menarik, sangat bervariasi tentang wajah-wajah di Indonesia. Dan ini usaha pertama seperti ini pada tahun 1920-an, 30-an dicoba melalui ilustrasi oleh Pak Pirngadi yang sekarang karyanya diabadikan di Museum Nasional. Dan saya melihat ini semua sebagai pintu untuk mengenali masa lalu Indonesia yang lebih baik. Dan terima kasih Pak Scott. Sekarang saya punya bukunya hampir lengkap. Saya belum punya yang Batavia. Jadi mungkin dalam waktu dekat kalau mampir di Periplus saya akan ambil Batavia sehingga punya 4-4-nya nanti. Dan kepada Periplus yang terus setia menerbitkan buku-buku bermutu, saya sangat berterima kasih Pak Yudo dengan tim. Dan berharap tentunya ke depan kita akan melihat lebih banyak lagi ya karya-karya baik. Dan oh ya, sebagai informasi, sekarang Museum Nasional Indonesia sudah bisa karena menjadi badan layanan umum, jadi dia juga punya sayap dalam quote unquote bisnis gitu. Jadi nanti Pak Yudo kita bisa duduk bareng-bareng mungkin dengan Pak Scott, lihat apalagi yang bisa kita terbitkan, kita publikasikan ya untuk terus memperkenalkan kebudayaan Indonesia ke luar negeri. Saya kira itu yang bisa disampaikan dan terima kasih sekali lagi untuk semua atas acara yang luar biasa di sore hari ini. Demikian.
Terima kasih Pak Hilmar. Saya sendiri ingat waktu mengedit story setelah launching buku Pak Scott yang ketiga, Pak Scott itu pernah bilang kalau dia nggak tertarik untuk meneruskan story tentang Jakarta setelah 1980-an karena terlalu modern. Dan he said, I quote, let the next generation of historians and write that. And if my wife allows, and I'm willing to make the fourth book, it will go back to the 19th century. Dan hasilnya seperti yang sekarang kita lihat adalah Faces of Indonesia, 500 Postcards 1900-1945. Dan saya ingin sedikit share screen tentang dari Pak ini sendiri. Mungkin bisa dibantu dari ini ya, dari Periplus, share screen. Sebentar, saya bisa ya. Ini saya mau share screen. Tentang the author. Jadi Pak Scott Merrillees ini mana ini ya, adalah seorang penulis dan historian yang lahir tahun 1962 di Melbourne. Dia juga graduate dari University of Melbourne yang majornya itu di Accounting and Indonesian Studies. Dan dia sangat fasih berbahasa Indonesia karena mempelajari bahasa Indonesia itu dari high school dan dari University of Australia dan juga di Satya Wacana University Salatiga. Dan ia telah bekerja di Jakarta selama 25 tahun dan juga mengkoleksi postcard hampir 30 tahun. Next. Ya. Jadi ini buku pertamanya, Batavia in 19th Century Photograph, yang sangat komprehensif ya, dari tentang Jakarta dari tahun 1850 dan lebih pada foto-foto tentang kota, tentang bangunan, landscape. Terus buku ini juga udah memasuki cetakan yang kelima. Next. Buku selanjutnya adalah Greeting from Jakarta, Postcard of Capital, 1900-1930. Ini juga komprehensif sekali dan sudah diterjemahkan ke bahasa Belanda. Selanjutnya, yang 2015, Pak Scott itu menerbitkan Jakarta, Portrait of a Capital 1930-1980. Di sini banyak sekali diceritakan tentang monumen-monumen di Jakarta yang menunjukkan Jakarta sebagai kota idamannya Pak Soekarno, misalnya. Yang terakhir, yang sekarang, next, adalah Faces of Indonesia. Ini yang akan kita dengarkan nanti dari Pak Scott sendiri langsung. Terima kasih, itu share screen ya. Oke, Pak Scott. We want to see an inside look of the new book now, right from you. Over to you, Pak Scott.
Thank you very much, Bu Stevi dan Mbak Puspa dan juga terima kasih banyak kepada Pak Hilmar, ya, suatu kehormatan besar bagi saya dan juga bagi kita semua bahwa Bapak Hilmar bersedia hadir untuk presentasi ini hari ini, dan atas kesediaan Bapak untuk memberikan keynote address, saya mengucapkan terima kasih sebanyak-banyaknya. I would like to share screen kalau bisa, dan oleh kerana buku ini ditulis dalam bahasa Inggris, dianggap lebih baik kalau sebagian besar saya bicara dalam bahasa Indonesia. Jadi saya coba share screen. Bu Stevi, apakah bisa melihat presentasinya?
Ya, ya, jelas sekali Pak.
Oke, jadi saya full screen. Okay. Very good, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here today. I'd firstly like to thank Periplus, Pak Judo, and the great team at Periplus, who I have known for just over 20 years. And it's a great pleasure, a great honor to be invited to give this presentation today. A remarkably stable team at Periplus too. So many people there at Periplus now, including Pak Judo, were there 20 years ago. So it's a remarkable stability, Pak Judo, for which is a great credit to Java Books and Periplus. And also thank you once again to Pak Hilmar. And I will make sure you get the copy of Batavia, Pak Hilmar, so that you have a complete collection. This book, Faces of Indonesia, 500 Postcards, 1900 to 1945, is very different to my first three books. They were very much about the development of Jakarta, urban development of Jakarta, and how Jakarta, Batavia evolved from the middle of the 19th century up until 1980. And I stopped at 1980 because I first arrived in Indonesia in 1981, nearly 40 years ago, but I decided I would stop my research into Jakarta the year before I arrived, therefore I stopped in 1980. But one thing I became aware of when I was researching and collecting was that there are some wonderful postcards and photographs of the people of Indonesia before Indonesia actually became Indonesia. It's really quite interesting. I mean, as we know, in Indonesia, we have Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, unity in diversity, because Indonesia truly is a wonderfully diverse country. You have so many different ethnic groups, so many different islands, so many different ethnic languages, and yet it's all now part of one country, the country of Indonesia, which was declared independent on the 17th of August 1945. And yet before the 17th of August 1945, of course, the people of Indonesia would not have said, saya orang Indonesia. They would have said, I am Batak, or I am Karo Batak, or I am South Balinese, or I am from Kupang, or I am Sundanese, or I am Javanese, or I am Bugis, or I am Minahasan, or I am a Dayak. So, and they wouldn't have spoken the same languages either. I mean, now we take it for granted. Everybody in Indonesia speaks Indonesian, but that wasn't always the case. And of course, 100 years ago, people didn't travel very much anyway. But can you imagine if 100 years ago, someone from, let's say, Pulau Samosir in North Sumatra traveled to Bali, for example? Well, it's traveling from one part of Indonesia to another. But the people would not have been able to speak with each other unless they spoke Malay. Obviously, those involved in trade spoke Malay, but the rest wouldn't. Just equally, if a Sundanese person went to North Sulawesi, they would not have been able to speak to each other. If someone from Kupang went to Jakarta, they would not have been able to speak to each other. So, and their customs and their jewelry and their clothing would all have been different. So just a really fascinating amount of diversity. So just before I show you the postcards, I would like to read the introduction so you can understand why I wrote this book and what the objectives are, why I collected these postcards and why I put them in this book. This book, Faces of Indonesia, 500 Postcards, 1900 to 1945, aims to highlight the remarkable diversity among the people of Indonesia before independence was declared on the 17th of August 1945, and before the concept of the nation of Indonesia was widely discussed or understood outside elite political or intellectual circles. I mean, of course, you had the elite intellectuals in 1928, 1926 with the Sumpah Pemuda, but that's only a tiny, tiny proportion of the population. The 500 beautiful picture postcards reveal the people of Indonesia across the entirety of the vast archipelago, quite literally from Sabang to Merauke, from when they still identified only with their own local ethnic group or clan or community, and most spoke only their own local language, not the Indonesian language. It is a diversity no longer witnessed today, but which provides a clear basis for understanding the choice of the national motto, Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, or unity in diversity. The postcards in the book are presented in 6 chapters: Sumatra, Java, Bali and Lombok, Kalimantan, Sulawesi, and Eastern Indonesia. And I have written essays at the beginning of each of these chapters. And these essays include contemporary travel accounts, observations, and descriptions from books, journals, and magazines from the period 1890s to the 1940s. As such, the book helps to reveal how the people of Indonesia were represented both visually and in writing during the last half century before Indonesian independence in 1945. So, as I mentioned, there are 6 chapters, and we will look at each of these individually, and we are using postcards. Postcards are a much underappreciated source of historical research. And let's not forget, too, the golden age of postcards was 1900 to 1915. And so the majority of the postcards in the book give us a picture of how the people of Indonesia were represented 100 years ago. So it's the approach that we have taken. We look first at chapter 1, Sumatra. What we have here, starting right at the very top, quite literally postcard number 4 on the far right, is Sabang, Pulau, where is Sabang? At the beginning of the 20th century, what was very much in people's minds, if we were talking about Sabang or North Sumatra, the very tip of North Sumatra, was Aceh. The Achenese War had just ended, and in 1903, officially at least anyway. And we can see here postcards 1 and 2 on the left. You can see Chut Putru, who was the wife of the Achenese Sultan, Muhammad Daud Shah. And then the next postcard is the Crown Prince, Prince Ibrahim, Tuanku Ibrahim. They were kidnapped by the Dutch forces in November 1902 as part of the plan to force the Achenese to surrender to the Dutch and therefore hopefully end the Achenese War. Indeed, the Sultan did surrender the following year in 1903, and that it can be argued, although not everybody would agree, it can be argued that was the official end to the Achenese War. However, it was very noticeable that the surrender of the Sultan did not bring really an end to the war. The guerrilla war continued for many years. And this is because the type of man that we can see in postcard number 3 here, Tuku Raja Hitam, who was an Ule Balang in Aceh. The Ule Balangs wielded very considerable authority, and even with the Sultan surrendering, the Ule Balang wielded very considerable authority in their provinces. In a book published in 1909 called 20th Century Impressions of Netherlands, India, it was written about the Ule Balang, and I quote, "At the disposal of the Ule Balangs for the maintenance of their authority are their blood relatives, their followers who receive housing, food, and clothing for themselves and their families, and those who have become his owing to debt and are therefore bondsmen, also the Panglima Perang, the military commander, who has distinguished himself as a warrior, and when he is required to do battle for his Ule Balang, received a loan of weapons from the latter." So certainly very much at the minds of people at the beginning of the 20th century was the Aceh War. And Aceh, there are actually quite a good number of postcards of Aceh. It was quite frequently photographed. It's not surprising, as we see here, that there are postcards showing Achenese soldiers. Let's not forget the Achenese War went from 1873 until 1903 officially. And so the Achenese were very, very successful fighters, very clever fighters. Several national heroes, of course, came out of Aceh, such as Tuku Umar, Chut Nyakdin, Chut Mutia, and Tuku Chiktatiro. So it's not surprising that given that the Achenese put up such a strong fight against the Dutch for 30 years, that we would see these very successful guerrilla soldiers appearing in postcards like we see here from around 1910. Also, we see here some beautiful postcards that were photographs by a prominent Dutch photographer, Charles Benjamin Nieuwenhuis. These were photographs taken in his studio, a temporary studio in Kutaraja in Banda Aceh around 1905. They are really lovely photographs. And it's interesting to note that the photograph on the far left, the lady in postcard number 5, she's described here as a prominent Achenese woman. Well, in fact, in 1969, there was a stamp, a perangko, issued by the Indonesian Post Office, which actually said that she was Chut Mutia, and the face in this photograph was used in that particular postage stamp. It's now generally believed, though, that this is not Chut Mutia, because it doesn't really make sense that Chut Mutia, who fought against the Dutch as a guerrilla fighter right up until the end of her life in 1910, it doesn't make sense that she would go into a Dutch photographer's studio in Banda Aceh in 1905 to get her photograph taken. So we don't know if these photographs, or this photograph, who these men and women are in these photographs, but it's almost certain, I feel, that the lady on the left is not Chut Mutia. But Nieuwenhuis was a very accomplished photographer, and these are beautiful representations of the people of Aceh approximately 1905. Moving from Aceh down to North Sumatra, North Sumatra was generally seen as having two main sources of interest. One were the Bataks, and the second source of interest was the growth of Medan. The plantation industry around Medan was of great interest because at the beginning of the 20th century, Sumatra became very important economically because of, for example, oil and rubber. And so Medan boomed from being a sleepy town in the 1880s. It had become very important by about 1910. So a lot of people were fascinated by the Bataks, for example, and they noticed a number of things. Firstly, that there were three different religions amongst the Bataks. You had the traditional beliefs, like we see in these postcards here. You have traditional Batak priests who still performed a very important spiritual role for many people. But you also had the missionary activities of the German Rhine mission starting in the 1860s. There was a very successful German missionary called Ludwig Nommensen, who spent more than half a century in North Sumatra as a missionary who very skillfully blended Protestant Christianity with the traditional beliefs in many Batak communities. And so the Batak Christian groups prospered and grew to very large numbers. Even today, of course, we can see the Christian community in the Batak areas of North Sumatra, and because many of them have moved to Jakarta and elsewhere, very strong Christians amongst them. And I've also been to a church in North Sumatra where the sermon was given in Bahasa Batak as well. And of course, there were many Muslims among the Batak as well, particularly in the north as you get closer to Aceh, and in the south as you get closer to Padang. And of course, it was also noticed that there were many different types of buttocks. One observer in the earlier 20th century observed, and I quote, "Among the buttocks, 3 chief groups or main tribes are distinguished, namely the Tobas, the Mandailingas, the Dairias, which distinction is chiefly based on the difference of the dialects spoken by each of these principal groups." And they also go on to talk about there being the Timur buttocks, who live northeast of the Toba Lake, and southeast of these are the Raja buttocks, who are regarded as a subdivision of the Timur buttocks. Then you have the Papak buttocks, west of Toba Lake, and you have the Karo buttocks and the higher ground to the north of the lake. So most postcard publishers didn't really distinguish between the different groups, except this particular set of postcards published by Kohler and Company in the mid-1920s portray the Karo buttocks specifically. The distinctive clothing, usually indigo blue color, and the distinctive jewelry of the ladies in the Batak lands was also very much noticed by visitors. We have 4 ladies here, and I describe this as being young and old. If you go left to right, you have a young Batak woman, and then all the way to an older lady on the far right. And you can notice the very distinctive circular earrings and headgear which the ladies are wearing. And this attracted a lot of commentary. For example, in 1920, the National Geographic magazine observed, and I quote, "The earrings worn by many of the women were of extraordinary dimensions. Only the wealthier could afford them, for each pair was worth about 150 gulden and must have represented a considerable part of the family treasure. They consisted of long circular rods of solid silver, about 3/8 of an inch in diameter, passed through the upper part of the ear and bent back into the form of double reversed coils, the coils projecting far forward on the left side, to the rear on the right. Their weight would have torn them from their ears had they not been partially supported by the corners of the headdresses, and there was apparently no way of removal without first uncoiling one side." It was also very much noticed in North Sumatra that most of the labor in the plantations was imported. So we can see many Chinese arrived in Medan to be shopkeepers, plantation workers. This was a major boost for the economy to have labor come from not only China, but also India. There were many Indians come, and they often, different ethnic groups often had their own quite distinctive functions. But there's quite a lot of diversity in Medan even now, of course. And I've traveled to Medan many times. There's a little India even there today. And the Chinese, of course, very well represented. Of course, many Bataks as well. And the Malay as well, Christians, Hindu and Muslim as well. So enormous amount of diversity, really triggering back to the beginning of the 20th century when a shortage of local labor and a very great demand for labor on the plantations brought in people from all over Asia, particularly China and India. I also mentioned these 4 photographs by one particular photographer, Charles Kleingrotter, who was a German photographer, very skillful photographer. These are beautiful photographs, beautifully posed. Here are 2 more of them, a Batak lady and a Malay lady. These are very beautiful photographs, and Kleingrotter offered these for sale in 1911 and again in 1913. And really they are a great historical record, but also beautiful art as photographs as well. Moving on from North Sumatra to West Sumatra, it was there's really only one thing people commented on in West Sumatra, and that was the matriarchal nature of Minangkabau society. This fascinated visitors to West Sumatra to see that the structure of society. And there was a guidebook published in 1897 which amongst many books which talk about how this matriarchal Minangkabau society operated. And I think many of the observers may have made mistakes with their observations, but they all certainly tried to understand. And for example, from the KPM Guide through the Netherlands Indies in 1897, and I quote, "It is a well-known fact that the ladies of the West Coast have a lot more say than the gentlemen, owing to the rules of the matriarchy. A man and a woman marrying, both of them remain in their own family circle. The husband goes to reside with his wife only temporarily, and she remains head of the house. Her children remain in her family and inherit her property, as well as half of what the husband and the wife may earn together. The other half of the latter goes to the sisters of the husbands or the sisters' children." So this was a great source of fascination to visitors to Padang, Bukit Tinggi, and the Minangkabau areas. Finally, in Sumatra, we look at an area which was remote 100 years ago, and it's still quite remote today. I mean, I've never been to Nias, and I bet many people on this presentation today have never been to Nias. But Nias was again fascinating too because of the warrior-like society which existed on Nias, and it was an ancient warrior culture, and this is what people tended to comment on, and their uniforms, their coats of metal, sheet metal, which takes the place of rhinoceros hide. Really very, very striking, and it's not surprising photographers went there to photograph Nias warriors. And the photograph on the top left hand corner and also the second one from the right were by Nieuwenhuis, the same photographer we saw who was working in Aceh about a dozen years before these photographs were taken. So these are wonderful historical records. Just look at this postcard number 63, second from the right, just a stunning photograph of an important Nias warrior in full gear on the right there. Now moving on to Java, having crossed across from Sumatra to Java, we can see quite naturally that there was a great deal of fascination amongst the royal houses. Yogyakarta and Surakarta or Solo were compulsory. Every visitor to Java who was there and who had time would go to Java. We see here Yogyakarta. So we have Sultan Hamengkubuwono VII, and at the top left-hand side, then we have Prince Pakualam from the Pakualam Secondary Royal House in Jogja. Below that, then we have two postcards of Sultan Hamengkubuwono VIII, the grandfather of the current Sultan. And we can also point out too that the photograph of Sultan Hamengkubuwono VII was taken by Kasian Sefas, who was the first great Indonesian photographer, and he was attached to the royal court of Yogyakarta for many years, from around the 1870s till the early 1900s, and we'll see more photographs of his later on. And the photographer of the Pakualam photograph, Prince Pakualam VII, was another famous photographer, Tassilo Adam, who was a German photographer who was active in Indonesia in the 1920s. Now we go to Surakarta, and again, fascination with the royalty. Here we have Susunan Pakubuwono IX and Raden Ayu Kustia. And then on the right-hand side, we have Susunan Pakubuwono X. And so again, great interest in the royalty, the courts, and very frequently represented in postcards. Now, in the two postcards on the left-hand side, they were published around 1910. But what is very interesting is these photographs of Susunan Pakubuwono IX on the left. These photographs were actually taken in the 1860s. And so it's an interesting situation where you have photographs that are almost 50 years old being used for postcards. Now, Tio Tek Hong was a prominent businessman in Pasar Baru in Batavia, and he obviously obtained some of these images, perhaps when the Woodbury and Page or Bussenbender and Co. studio closed in 1908. And So it's really quite interesting. I mean, they're very striking photographs. I mean, they're striking and interesting even now, 150 years after they were taken. So it's not surprising that Teo Te Kong, the postcard publisher, published them as postcards circa 1910. So we have here a case of a postcard publisher who was not responsible for taking the photographs. He bought the photographs and then published them as postcards. This differs compared to, for example, like Kleingrote or Nieuwenhuis, who we have seen earlier in Sumatra, who were the photographer and also the publisher of the postcards. There are also some beautiful postcards published in Yogyakarta of those who served the sultans. So here we have the priai, the aristocratic elite below the royal family, but still very senior, very important officials. And again, the photograph on the left is a photograph by the great Indonesian, the great Javanese photographer Kasian Sefas. And so there was a great deal of interest in court life and court, the way the courts operated and who served the sultans. And then, of course, you have, again, beautiful postcards, the servants, the abdi dalam, the guards, the servants of the court, those who carried the all-important payung, the siri, and whatever the sultan or the many family members needed. On the guards, on the right, again, the stunning photograph, second from the right, is by the German photographer Tassilo Adam. And then you have another one by Kasian Sefas on the far right. There were many postcards made of the Javanese people at work. I have about 70 different postcards of the Javanese doing their various jobs, carrying out their particular occupations. And it was a real fascination for photographers and postcard publishers. And here we have men at work performing very traditional functions. We have kris makers on the left, and it's quite amusing. On the far left, it looks like the two men are arguing with each other. So that's I'd like to know what that conversation was about. And on the right-hand side, we have two men involved in making a wayang kulit. Then we have men at work again, but in very modern functions, a recognition of modern technology, plus also interaction with the European, predominantly Dutch, but not entirely Dutch influence. So we have, for example, telegram delivery boys at the top left-hand corner. We have hotel employees at the bottom left, and also second from the right. And then interestingly, on the far right, we have young Dutch boys who are working in the pharmacy of a hospital. So particularly after the ethical policy was announced by Queen Wilhelmina in 1901, we have new opportunities opening up for education. For the ladies, occupations, again, very interesting. And batik was obviously one of great importance. And all four of these postcards here depict ladies involved in producing batik. The photograph second from the left, that lovely smiling lady looking directly at the camera, that's a photograph taken by Tilly Wiesenborn. She was the most famous European female photographer in the colonial era. And she was based in Garut. That's a lovely photograph. The one at the bottom right-hand corner is actually in Tanah Abang. And Sven, if you're there today, put this one in for you. And batik making in Tanah Abang, which is, of course, in Jakarta. And we don't think today of Jakarta being a location for the production of batik. But 100 years ago, a lot of batik was made, be it in Palmera or Tanah Abang or other areas of Jakarta. I also point out, too, that sometimes these postcards which show pretty smiling ladies and their batik are not always an accurate description of the lives some of these women led, because you can see the postcard on the top right-hand corner. This lady and three girls look like they're sadly living in quite abject poverty, so that their batik is not providing them with much of an income. But this particular series of postcards published in 1919 certainly showed Java as it really was, and not some idealized version of necessarily how people wanted it to be, which probably Tilly Wiesenborn did quite successfully with the photo, with a lovely smiling lady second from the left. And here we have some other ladies at work. We have obviously jamu, coffee, and also selling food, and to some extent, as you would see today. And as I mentioned earlier, education opened up for many people in particularly Java from 1901. And so there were many more schools where Indonesians could have access to a good education. And I deliberately chose the postcard on the top right-hand corner for the front cover of the book, because it shows a group of 7 young boys in Bandung who are reading the Bintang Hindia newspaper. And it really shows, I think, the spirit of them very enthusiastically getting into their education. We now go on back to the courts, the royal courts, and here we have the court dances, some beautiful images of some of the dances. The second from the left and the bottom right, photographs by Tarsilo Adam. They are the Bedoyo, the court dancers of the Sultan. And of course, the Sultans were, only the Sultan was allowed to have 9 dancers. And you can see the bottom right-hand corner, there are indeed 9 dancers, which tells us that in fact, this was the Bedoyo dancers of the Sultan. And the lead dancer was the girl, Bibi Radia, Bibi Radia, who we can see second from the left. We also see male dancers, and of course, Wayang Wong, where men played a very significant role. I love that postcard second from the left, the man where we can see the front of him, but he's looking away from the camera at a right angle away from us. And again, another photograph, almost certainly by Tarsilo Adam, very muscular, strong looking man, but beautiful composition, a stunning photograph. Apart from the court dances that we've seen, there was also, of course, the ronggeng, the najub, I think they're now called the tayuban or the tayub, itinerant musicians who would perform at parties, perform at dances where a household having a party could retain them, and they would travel from house to house, maybe from town to town, and looking to make their income that way. But they were obviously quite a very distinct difference to the court dances that we saw in the earlier postcards. Of course, we have some of the stunning beauties of Central Java. These are photographs by Cassian Cephas, the great Indonesian photographer. Really beautiful photographs, and really beautifully hand-colored before they were printed. The publisher here was Tan Bier of Yogyakarta, and he really went to extraordinary lengths to produce some of the most beautiful postcards, I think, that have ever been published in Indonesia. Really taking outstanding photographs and then very sensitively coloring them as well. And of course, in Sunda as well, West Java, again, beautiful ladies from Sunda, and we have 4 different photographers here, so all in their own different styles. The one second from the right, the lady staring very assertively towards us with her many necklaces, supposedly a lady from Bogor, a very stunning image. The one on the far right, also almost certainly taken by the Dutch female photographer, Tilly Wiesenborn. I mentioned earlier that there's one particular series of postcards that looked at perhaps some of the areas that you might call poverty on Java. And it's a very unusual theme for postcards, but this was a series published in 1919, and there were many of them. And again, sadly, we were seeing children here who very much living in poverty. So it wasn't always the glamorous image of these beautiful women in their glorious batik. there was obviously a different side to Java in some of the villages, and this particular series of postcards published in 1919 picked that up as well. Not wanting to rush, but we have to obviously remember the time. We go now to chapter 3, Bali and Lombok, and Bali and Lombok actually very different to the rest of Indonesia, because for everywhere else in Indonesia, there were many postcards from the late 1890s through to 1900, 1905, 1902, 1906, through to 1910, many postcards. But Bali and Lombok, or particularly Bali, there are almost no postcards before 1910 that show people. Bali, very different. There were very few photographers in Bali before 1910. The Dutch really only brought Bali under colonial control in 1908. And there were horrible puputan, the ritual suicides, terrible puputan in 1906 and 1908. And the Dutch military administration, the colonial government, discouraged visitors to Bali, and it was very difficult to get there. So there are very few postcards of Bali from before 1910. So I put this first series of postcards in because these are a series published by Kolff in 1911, 1912. Now, 1911, 1912 wouldn't be regarded as early for the rest of Indonesia, but these were very early for Bali. And it wasn't really until 1914 that tourism started very slowly in Bali, but it wasn't until the 1920s that it really got going. And Bali is the only chapter in this book where most of the postcards are after 1920. All the other chapters, most of the postcards are before 1920. Bali, the opposite, they're after 1920, mainly because that's only really when photographers and tourists started going into Bali. And of course, there's a fascination with royalty. We have, there were, in the 19th century, there were 9 kingdoms in Bali. By the beginning of the 20th century, that had become 8. And so little Bali had essentially 8 kings, really, 8 princes, 8 regents, however you want to describe them. This photograph on the top left-hand corner was another similar, like I mentioned earlier, a Woodbury and Page photograph from the 1860s, published by Teo Tek Hong in 1910. But the other 3 postcards on this page are very much contemporary. So on the right, you're looking at the princes of Karangasem, Gianyar, and Bangli. And so again, royalty plays a prominent role. The other important thing that people noticed about Bali was it's Hindu. The rest of Indonesia, very predominantly Muslim, although certain parts, the Christian missionaries had made an important influence. But Bali alone was Hindu. So these priests, both male and female, played a very important role. And of course, wonderful attractions for the tourists in Bali were the dancers. And particularly the female dancers, the tourists to Bali were forever photographing the dancers. The legong, the janga were being performed. Some of the dancers became very famous in their own right. And there are, but these postcards are all from the 1930s. And the rest of the book doesn't have many postcards from the 1930s, but Bali, there are many. So again, the legong on the top left-hand corner, the janga on the right-hand side. Also, on the subject of Balinese dance, these postcards are interesting for 2 reasons. One, these are actual color photographs. Many of the from 1931. Color photography really only started in the late 1910s, although didn't really get going to the late 1920s, like Kodak's autochromes, for example. So these are actual color photographs as compared to black and white photographs that were where the negatives were hand colored before printing. These are stunningly beautiful color from Balinese dancing at the Paris Colonial Exposition of 1931. It was the first time a group of Balinese dancers had gone to Europe, and they performed in Paris in 1931, and they were stunningly successful. The Europeans, in the middle of the Great Depression, were enthralled, enchanted. They'd never seen Balinese dance in Europe before. The dancing, the beauty, the costumes, the music were a great success. Every session was sold out, and the media went wild about these beautiful dancers. Again, women at work. The subject of work was interesting. People who went to Bali noticed that the women seemed to do a lot more work than the men did. The men didn't seem to do a lot of work. I don't mean to say that offensively, but this is the observation that were made at the time. The women seemed to do most of the work. So here we have the women who are weaving, women carrying the water on their heads, and on the far right we have a woman who's even painting a house painting on the right, up the ladder, painting the house, which I think in most parts of the world that would be regarded as very, very unusual. And here there are women who were selling sarongs, and more women repairing fishing nets, selling food and making baskets. So again, a common observation, people visiting Bali, was that the women seemed to do all the work. So that was certainly an interesting observation. Moving on to, just before I leave Bali, it's interesting too that with Bali, you don't see in postcards of Bali the schools and the hospitals built by Christian missionaries or the Dutch government. You don't see plantations like you would see in Sumatra, because the colonial government didn't want this. They wanted Balinese culture to remain pure, and hence there were no factories. It wasn't possible for foreigners to lease, or the Dutch or other foreigners or Chinese to lease large amounts of land for plantations. There were no factories, and Christian missionaries were largely banned. And so it was the Dutch very consciously sought to maintain pure Balinese culture and to develop it as almost a tourist attraction, which was again extremely successful in the 1920s and 1930s before the Second World War. Coming up to chapter 4 now, we're now looking at Borneo, and there was a great fascination with the Dayaks. Borneo was one of these places which filled people with horror and dread, particularly those living in the West. Just like people talk about deepest, darkest Africa, it was almost like deepest, darkest Borneo as well. Borneo was like a place you went into and never came out of again. You might have been taken by a python or eaten by a headhunter or speared by a Dayak. And so again, there was a lot of fear about really what was going on in Borneo, but it became economically important because of the oil, particularly through Balikpapan. But a great fascination for the Dayaks, and were they still headhunters, and was it safe to travel in Borneo? And so that was of great interest. And here these postcards of Dayak wewomen. And I think on the left is quite interesting too, because we're looking at the interesting earrings which the Dayak women are wearing there. And also some of the Christian missions, both Catholic and Protestant, were very successful in Borneo. And all of these 4 postcards in this particular slide show the work of various either Protestant or Catholic missions in different parts of Borneo. For example, Singkawang on the top left-hand corner. And so again, the Christians, some missionaries there were really quite successful. Sulawesi, we'll look at Sulawesi now. The part of Sulawesi that was best understood and best known was Makassar, not surprisingly, and particularly the Bugis. The Bugis were known to be great sailors, great navigators, people who were observed to be not very attached to their own homeland or their hometown, and they were very frequently traveling outside, usually as sailors and navigators. And so the Bugis were a source of frequent comment and attention by visitors and writers and photographers who visited Makassar. Another feature of Sulawesi also was small kingdoms, like we've seen elsewhere in the book, there were many, many small kingdoms in different parts of Indonesia, and Sulawesi was no exception. We see here at the top the king of Bone, which was near Makassar, and then we have the queen of Tanete, again another small kingdom, and it's again very much a part of Indonesian history prior to 1950. There were many small kingdoms right throughout Indonesia, and at various times they were fighting the Dutch, or fighting each other, or seeking protection from the Dutch, and the political alliances changed quite a lot. But because there were many of these kingdoms, it became relatively easy for the colonial forces to pacify them. Very different to Japan. In Japan, after 1605, you had the Tokugawa shogunate, and that was the first time Japan had been unified. So it was a lot more difficult for the Dutch to penetrate into Japan. Whereas because in Indonesia there were so many different kingdoms, many of them small, it became relatively easy for them to be pacified when the Dutch gradually expanded their colonial territories. Interestingly, too, in the 1920s, 1930s, the Toraja areas were very much unknown, and again there were headhunters there, or they were believed to be headhunters in Toraja, and of course Toraja, well into the inland of South Sulawesi, up at the northern part of South Sulawesi, and the rest of the world was only beginning to see the Toraja lands as we get into the 1920s, 1930s. And the postcard second from the right, you can see Pomaramba, who was the king of Rantapau. Of course, Rantapau is the cultural capital of the Toraja lands now, but it's an example of another small kingdom. There just were so many of these small kingdoms. But the Dutch, of course, allowed the kings or queens to retain their authority, at least nominally, so long as the kings or the queens essentially followed Dutch instruction. And finally, chapter 6. Hopefully, I've got 5 more minutes, Bustivi. So, chapter 6, Eastern Indonesia, and again very interesting, and felt to be very remote for many people back in the early part of the 20th century. And of course, parts of Eastern Indonesia are still remote even today. But we can see in the following postcards how the people of Eastern Indonesia were represented. So first we have Nusa Tenggara Timur, which starting with Flores, really some quite stunning photographs again. Look at these are all published by a Dutch mission, the Mission House of St. Jan in Soesterberg, and they were published in around 1940. Look at the man on the left. What a stunning photograph there with his long hair and the expressions on his face. Then look at the postcard next to that. Look at the eyes of the woman carrying the baby, and look at the baby staring directly into the camera. Really stunning photographs. And one of my favorites is this postcard, the bottom right-hand corner. These 3 girls in the very long hair. Look how thick that hair is, and that girl in the center there. I just love her smile. Really quite extraordinary. But these are indications of the work that was being done very successfully by some of the Christian missions in Flores. Then we go across to the Dutch part of Timor, which of course was West Timor, still in Nusa Tenggara Timor. The bottom right-hand corner, yet another small kingdom. So the king of Beboki op Timor met vrouw en kinderen, the king of Beboki on Timor with his vrouw and his wife and children. So yet another kingdom. And the postcard above that, again, very interesting aspects of different cultural observations that visitors were making when they went to Timor, over a century ago. And of course, the Alor Islands, and also East Nusa Tenggara, just north of Timor. Again, seem to be very warlike people. If you can see, they're carrying spears, and engaging in war dances. And the postcard on the right, the translation, correct me if my Dutch is not good enough, Harold or Sven, but it's the notorious headhunters in their military attire. So certainly another part of Indonesia, just like the Nias people we saw west of Sumatra, the people of Alor, just north of Timor, were also felt to be very militaristic and fierce. Then on to Ambon in the Moluccas. So we go from Nusa Tenggara Timur to Maluku, and we now have Ambon. These are beautiful photographs. I don't know who the photographer was. The two photographs on the right are just stunning. Narhet faced means to the party. The photograph on the right, Narhet Kerk, to the church. The one on the right reminds me of that great Dutch painter Anthony van Dyck. His photograph, his painting, I think of what Charles I or whoever it was, where essentially you had two images in profile and one face on. Really very, very skillful photographs, but it's interesting representations of women in Ambon. Then we have also in the Moluccas, we have the Tanimbar Islands, north of Darwin, south of West Papua. Again, a part of Indonesia I'm sure most people have never been to today, and certainly very few went to 100 or 120 years ago. But again, very interesting with their own individual culture. In now Maluku Utara, its own separate province. Just like with Ambon, just like with Flores, just like with the Bataks around Lake Toba, some of the Christian missionaries made great inroads. And you're looking here at a school on the top left-hand corner and at a hospital on the bottom left-hand corner. And you're looking second from the right, you have a teacher with his wife and family. They would be teaching in a Christian school. So again, an area in the North Moluccas where the Christian missionaries were very successful, and of course the strong Christian community remaining to this day. Now coming to the end, we have we started in Sabang, Pulau Ware, and we're now going to finish in Merauke, because Papua was of course West Papua, the westernmost part of the colonial of colonial Indonesia. And of course, it wasn't immediately part of Indonesia on independence, but after the in the early 1960s, West Papua was returned by the Dutch to Indonesia. And rather nicely, postcards 499 and postcards 500, the two on the right, which are the last two postcards in the book, are men from Merauke. So we have quite literally gone from Sabang to Merauke in the course of these 6 chapters. So, and of course, very, very striking with their attire and their hair decorations, their ear decorations, and what are their weapons as well. So I don't know how much time I've taken. I don't know if I've spoken to my limit, more under my limit or over my limit. But I'd like to thank you very much, everyone, for your attention. And thank you once again to Periplus for organizing this event today. And I thank everyone who's participated and given up your time on a Saturday afternoon or Saturday evening. And it's wonderful with Zoom that I can be here in Melbourne, and most of you can be in Indonesia, many of you in the wonderful city of Jakarta. And I know some of you are in Hong Kong or Singapore or Sydney and elsewhere. So wonderful technology, and thank you to Pak Judo and his team at Periplus for making this possible and putting all this together. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Scott. It was an amazing presentation. And for me personally, the book's not just beautiful for its postcards and essays, but also its design and extensive bibliography. For me, it's like a gift that you can open and open again. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
And it's so hard to choose the beautiful traditional costume, traditional rituals, batik and ulos making. And my personal favorite include the hunting lights in Bali.
Oh, yes.
I heard about it before. But never actually see it. So it's
Yes.
fascinating. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
So we're going to start the TA session, and maybe I'm going to ask you my question first.
Sure.
So on the postcards, since when you start collecting, and do you still have your first postcard? Can you share a story about it? I mean, it's not easy to collect something and just know that I have to be collecting postcards, something like that.
Thank you, Bustivi. I don't know if I have my first postcard. I started collecting postcards of Australia when I was a teenager. And I think some of those have probably got lost over the years, but I started collecting Indonesia in the early 1990s. I started working in Jakarta in 1989. And I think it would have been about the following year that I started collecting postcards. So about 30 years. And I started collecting initially only Java, but then I broadened to the rest of Indonesia, but then found that became too much. So I decided to focus on the people of Indonesia, and then I narrowed it down to Jakarta and Semarang and Central Java.
And there's a good question from Gerard van der Linde. He asked, if someone would start a collection now, what would be a good way to find such postcards? What would be your advice on how to source interesting postcards?
Very good question, Harold. The best way is to get to know the postcard dealers. And you have to get to know them because they never put their best stock online. I mean, you can buy postcards on various websites. Obviously, there's like eBay, or there's like Del Camp. They have millions of postcards on eBay and on Del Camp, and there are many others. But one thing I've noticed over the years that it's only when you start becoming a serious customer do the dealers then say, hey, I'm not putting my best material online. Do you want me to show you my best material? So I think you've got to get to know who the dealers are. For collecting Indonesian postcards of Indonesia, almost all the action is in Europe. So you've got a big advantage there, Harold. There are some very important postcard dealers in Holland, or the Netherlands, as I think it's called now. But France, postcards are very big in France, many French dealers. Germany, very big. And some funny places too, like Hungary. There's a very important postcard dealer in Hungary. The United States focuses mainly on the United States. So I haven't bought many postcards in the US. But if you're looking for postcards of Asia, then European postcard dealers. I started getting to know them through antiquarian book dealers, but over a period of time you get to know. But I'd be happy to share some names with you if you'd like to get in touch with them.
Are they expensive or?
You can buy postcards for $1, and you can buy postcards for $2,500 US.
Wow.
For one postcard. But for the average postcard, maybe $5, $10 US, $5 US, $10 US, $15 US, $20 US. But if someone's going to start showing you their good stock, you're probably talking about $50, $100, $200, $250 US for a single postcard or more. It can be a very rare image, or it might have a stamp on it as well, or a lovely postmark, or just be a particularly rare image of something which rarely appears in a postcard, or by a rare photographer, or just a very unique view. I mean, so yeah, it's certainly possible to pay more than $1,000 for an individual postcard. I haven't done that often. but it's very easy to pay $80 US, $100, $150, $200 postcard. Very easy to do that.
And the next question will be from Respati. Apa yang mendorong Pak Scott mendokumentasikan wajah Indonesia dalam beberapa buku yang indah ini?
Terima kasih Pak Respati. Ya. Bapak Respati. Ya ada beberapa hal ya, sebab ya, sebagaimana saya katakan sebelumnya ya, jadi kalau kita melihat Bhinneka Tunggal Ika sebagai moto lambang Indonesia, itu betul-betul melambangkan keadaan yang nyata. Jadi kalau kita misalkan ke Sumatra, terus jalan-jalan dari Sumatra, dari utara sampai ke selatan, dalam Sumatra pun ada banyak suku, banyak bahasa daerah, beberapa agama. Itu hanya Sumatra saja, sudah diversity sudah jelas sekali ya. Lebih lagi kalau kita misalkan ke Jawa atau Sunda, Jawa, terus ke Bali, ya, terus ke Kalimantan, Sulawesi, terus Indonesia Timur. Jadi ini lain sekali dengan misalkan Australia, negara saya, atau Inggris ya, atau Amerika juga ya. Jadi tidak ada ratusan suku atau ratusan bahasa daerah. Jadi ini satu ciri khas Indonesia yang sangat menarik ya. Dan saya juga sangat terkejut oleh kenyataan bahwa kalau misalkan orang Batak pergi ke Bali, jadi apakah mereka bisa berbicara satu sama lain atau tidak? Barangkali nggak bisa. Sebab mereka pakai bahasa apa? Orang Batak tidak mengerti bahasa Bali, orang Bali tidak mengerti bahasa Batak. Jadi kalau mereka mengerti bahasa Melayu, oke, bisa berbicara. Tapi yang mengerti bahasa Melayu sebagian besar yang berdagang, tinggal di daerah pesisir, dan yang berdagang atau pelaut yang perlu bahasa Melayu. Jadi dan juga baju sangat berbeda, perhiasan sangat berbeda. Jadi saya sangat tertarik oleh konsepnya. Jadi semua orang ini adalah, atau waktu itu, warga negara pulau-pulau yang sekarang semua udah menjadi Indonesia. Jadi tapi kebudayaannya sangat berbeda, sukunya sangat berbeda, adatnya berbeda, bahasa berbeda, perhiasan berbeda. Jadi itu yang menarik perhatian saya. Jadi saya sangat tertarik oleh diversity-nya, dan juga oleh karena ada cukup banyak tukang fotografer yang bagus, yang betul-betul bisa membuat foto yang bermutu tinggi, yang pergi ke daerah-daerah ini dan membuat foto yang betul-betul indah sekali. Terus foto-foto itu dijadikan kartu pos, jadi ada kesempatan untuk dijadikan koleksi. Jadi kita sangat beruntung bahwa kartu pos itu terbit ya, sebab kalau tidak ada, saya rasa pengetahuan kita sekarang mengenai nenek moyang orang Indonesia 100 tahun yang lalu jauh lebih miskin dan jauh lebih sedikit daripada sekarang oleh karena ada kartu pos ini.
Can you get them? Are they in good condition or not?
It depends. You always try and find good condition. I generally don't buy bad condition. I would only buy bad condition if the image was very rare and I wanted the image. But I mean, many postcards can be in bad condition, but dealers generally won't show you bad condition. No.
And the next question from Alex Kurniawan. What are the main challenges you faced when you made this book, and how did you solve the challenges?
Yeah, very interesting question. It's by Alex, is it? Thank you, Alex.
Alex, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. There are many challenges. At the beginning of each chapter, I have essays. I've written essays at the beginning of each chapter. And I wanted to find materials for those essays which described the contents of the postcards. With my book, I did not put a description on each page next to each postcard. I have one essay at the front of each chapter. And then in that essay, I try and describe as many of the postcards as possible. So it was a challenge. Actually, finding the postcards wasn't a challenge, but finding some of the materials from which I could use to write my essays was a big challenge. Another challenge by Alex was to only have 500 postcards. When I did the first draft of the book, I had 800 postcards for the book, because my collection's more than 2,000 postcards. And I initially wanted the book to be 800 postcards, but I realized that's silly. It would be a book that would be too expensive, nobody would buy it. And the book would be too heavy. And so it was quite tough to cut back from 800 to 650 to 550 and then to 500. It was also a challenge to try and be balanced, because I didn't want it to be too Java centric. I wanted Sumatra to have a strong presence. I wanted Borneo, Kalimantan and Sulawesi, Eastern Indonesia, Bali to have a strong presence. But for places like Kalimantan or Sulawesi, that's not easy, because there were not many postcards published in Sulawesi or of Sulawesi. Not many postcards published of Kalimantan. Whereas with Java, there were more than 1,000 maybe. And even for Bali after 1920, there were hundreds and hundreds. So for Java and Bali, easy. And even for Sumatra, not too difficult, particularly if you're talking about like North Sumatra, like Medan or Orang Batak. But then if you want to talk about Orang Palembang, Orang Jambi, Orang Lampung in South Sumatra, very difficult, because there were not many postcards produced in those areas, because not many photographers went to those areas.
Mm-hmm.
So they were some of the challenges which I faced. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And here, Diana also asked a question that the ones showing the theme of poverty really sparked her interest. Was that theme particularly sought after for postcard at that time?
Interesting question. No, it's very unusual. That was a very unusual theme. And most of the postcards showing poverty were published by one particular firm of, we only know them by their initial. I don't even know the photographers or the name of the firm. There's just the initials we know them by, but they were published in 1919. And clearly the photographer or the publisher was very intrigued by this series. Like you'll see also in the book, for example, he or she, they had one postcard showing, say, a rich family in Sunda, for example, but they would also have a poor family in Sunda. So they were making various sociological comparisons, which again was quite interesting. It wasn't just showing, say, a beautiful lady or a handsome prince. It was really early sociology, in a sense, that that poverty is there and there's wealth there as well, but there's also poverty. So, and this series was not only about poverty, but it's clearly the postcards about poverty which stand out. There were a few others. For example, beggars appear in quite a few postcards. They can be quite sad. But no, that wasn't very much an unusual theme, not common.
So it's not really specific targeting poverty as a theme.
No, it was a series focusing on Java, and but it didn't really include the sultans of Java, and it focused mainly on people and again occupations. Like I mentioned, there was a great fascination amongst postcard publishers with occupations, the jobs that people did. There are hundreds of postcards of occupations and pekerjaan. But it just so happens in this particular series from 1919, there were quite a few which certainly showed some of the sadder aspects of life on Java, not just the glamorous ones that photographers normally focused on. Yes.
And the next question will be from Sondang Susan. She asks, it's interesting to see the photos, especially from her hometown, North Sumatra.
Okay.
And her questions, which postcard that do you like the most?
Thank you, Bo. Thank you. I can see you there. Thank you for joining today. And I would find that difficult to choose. I think that series of 4 postcards of the 4 Batak ladies from very young through to very old, I think that's very striking. I deliberately showed them young through to old. I thought that was very striking. I love talented photographers doing wonderful things with their subjects. So the postcards by Kleingrote, like the postcards of the Batak lady and in the circular passepartout, and the Malay lady next to her, really striking images because of the skill of the photographer, really taking an interesting subject to begin with, but then really doing a lot with it because of the skill they had as photographers. So let me ask you the same question, but which ones do you like? But if you're looking to collect photographs of North Sumatra, you have a great choice, because many photographers, I mean, Medan was booming. If you look at the 1890s, 1900s, 1910s, 1920s, Medan was booming. And because it was booming, there were many photographers, many photographs, many postcards, and you could quite easily build a very good collection just of Medan or just of North Sumatra.
And we have several questions from Afkar Aristoteles. So it's best, I think, if I mention it one by one.
Okay.
Yeah. So the first in bahasa.
Okay.
Bagaimana fotografer Eropa seperti Nieuwenhuis bisa memotret beberapa foto etnik, padahal di tempat itu mungkin memiliki sentimen kepada orang Eropa terhadap akibat pertempuran yang sering terjadi. Jadi apa challenge-nya yang dihadapi oleh fotografer Eropa? Itu yang pertama.
Ya, itu menarik ya, sebab ya memang ada daerah-daerah di mana ada beberapa suku yang misalkan berperang dengan Eropa. Jadi ada tukang foto yang boleh dianggap cukup berani kalau mereka memang bawa kamera mereka ke daerah-daerah tertentu. Dan ada banyak tantangan untuk tukang foto waktu itu. Ya sekarang kita bisa pakai HP, ambil foto, kirim lewat WA ke teman di negara lain. Ya, tapi waktu itu mereka pakai glass plate cameras yang berat, perlu kimia yang banyak, dan juga prosesnya memakan waktu yang cukup lama. Jadi jauh lebih susah untuk menjadi tukang foto zaman itu dibandingkan dengan sekarang. Dan misalkan Jacobus Antonius Mason dari Belanda tahun 1860-an dia ke Nias. Itu ada yang barangkali bisa bilang dia berani, ada yang bisa bilang dia tidak begitu smart ya, karena
dangerous.
agak bahaya ya, tapi dan terus barangkali orang Nias 160 tahun yang lalu jarang melihat orang Belanda dan mereka suka berperang atau ya, tapi ya jadi memang mereka merintis fotografer seperti dia merintis fotografi. untuk kita semua. Sebab kalau mereka tidak berani untuk daerah-daerah tertentu, misalkan ada Velberg, dia ke daerah Batak dekat Pulau Samosir tahun 1870-an, kira-kira tahun 1875. Pada waktu itu masih dianggap ada headhunters di daerah Batak atau dekat Pulau Samosir. Jadi itu juga menjadi risiko besar, ya. Jadi dan memang ada missionary yang ditangkap oleh orang-orang di situ sebelum Velberg ke situ, tapi ya memang mereka berani, mereka harus sensitif terhadap kebudayaan. Tapi oleh kerana mereka ke situ dan mengambil foto, dan oleh kerana sebagian dari fotonya masih ada sampai sekarang, kita semua tahun 2021 bisa menikmatinya atau belajar daripadanya.
Terus pertanyaan berikutnya dari orang yang sama, untuk menjadi postcard di zaman itu, apakah ada indikasi kelayakan? Bagaimana foto yang bisa dijadikan postcard? Dan apakah Bapak tahu, biasanya itu fotografer tetap atau kontributor yang bisa dipakai?
Ya, ada macam-macam sebenarnya. Kadang-kadang, ya sebagaimana saya katakan sebelumnya, kadang-kadang tukang foto sendiri yang membuat postcard untuk dijual. Sebab tukang foto juga harus makan dari fotonya. Jadi dia barangkali menjual fotonya, atau foto dijadikan kartu pos, terus kartu pos dijual, atau fotografer menjual kartu pos ke penerbit kartu pos. Jadi fotografer sendiri tidak terbit kartu pos, tapi ada publisher yang mau membeli foto. Jadi ini memang semua berdasarkan keputusan komersial, ya. Jadi mereka mau membuat kartu pos dengan topik, dengan subjek, apa yang bisa dijual, ya. Jadi pembeli mau membeli kartu pos yang caranya bagaimana untuk kirim ke misalkan teman-teman di kota yang lain atau di negara yang lain, misalkan dari Jakarta ke Belanda, Jakarta ke Surabaya ke Perancis atau ke mana saja. Jadi yang menarik kalau melihat koleksi saya kartu pos Jakarta, ada hampir semua topik di kartu pos. Sebab lain daripada waktu saya masih kecil, kalau kartu pos kita biasanya hanya bisa melihat kartu pos kalau kita misalkan ke pantai, dan kita bisa membeli kartu pos, ada pantai, ada palm tree, ada matahari, dan kita kirim ke teman-teman di kampung sendiri. Tapi kalau ke 100 tahun yang lalu ada ratusan topik yang kelihatan di postcard. Misalkan sekolah, gedung pemerintahan, atau kantor telepon, atau kantor pos, atau gedung-gedung komersial, gedung-gedung yang dimiliki oleh perusahaan, atau ada tram, ada kereta api, ada stasiun kereta api. Jadi ini seakan-akan bahwa yang mau membeli dan mengirim kartu pos itu ke luar negeri mau memperlihatkan kepada sang penerima bahwa kami di sini di Batavia, di Surabaya, di Semarang tinggal di kota yang modern juga, bukan hanya Eropa yang modern, tapi kami di sini juga punya tram uap, atau tram listrik, atau kereta listrik, atau kantor telepon, atau gedung-gedung yang modern, atau gedung pemerintahan yang megah. Jadi ini seakan-akan ya sedikit mau supaya orang lain di negara lain bisa melihat bahwa betul-betul ada kemajuan di kota kita sendiri. So, jadi memang penerbit kartu pos harus, memang mereka mau survive sebagai bisnis, kan. Jadi mereka harus cetak apa yang mereka anggap bisa dijual.
Ini pertanyaan yang terakhir dari orang yang sama dan agak sensitif mungkin, ya. Jadi perempuan di Bali dalam berpakaian dadanya terekspos karena budaya mereka. Tapi fotografer yang memotretnya memiliki paham berpakaian yang berbeda dengan mereka. Apakah ada unsur mencari nudity oleh para fotografer yang memanfaatkan celah budaya ini untuk male pleasing?
Pasti ada. Ya. Terutama untuk laki-laki Eropa tahun 1930-an. Jadi bayangkan kalau melihat Eropa untuk 3 dasawarsa pertama di abad ke-20, jadi ada Perang Dunia Pertama, terus ada krisis moneter namanya Great Depression. Jadi jadi betul-betul suasana di Eropa sangat muram, sangat susah, sangat depressed ya. Jadi ada perang besar juga, ada Great Depression, krisis yang besar. Jadi waktu di Eropa ada yang mendengar bahwa ada Pulau Bali dengan memang perempuan cantik tidak pakai bagian atas, yang berdansa secara erotik dan menarik, pasti ada unsur menarik turis ke Bali untuk melihat sendiri. Jadi pasti begitu. Jadi memang untuk tidak memakai baju di bagian atas dianggap biasa untuk kelihatan budaya Bali waktu itu. Tapi memang saya rasa kira-kira tahun 1930-35 sudah diduga bahwa banyak orang Eropa tertarik oleh hal itu. Jadi mulai dari waktu itu, jadi itu berhenti sebenarnya, bahwa kalau melihat kartu pos dari misalkan sesudah tahun 1935, mereka pakai baju sampai ke leher, tidak expose lagi. Jadi sebab dianggap atau diduga bahwa ada terlalu banyak turis dari barat yang datang khusus untuk melihat itu. Memang ada unsur itu pasti.
Terus ini ada pertanyaan juga dari Evan Wijaya. Pak Scott, how do you do the background research for each postcard? Where to find those information?
Yeah, this is certainly a challenge. So you need to look for secondhand books like guidebooks published before 1940, hopefully in English, unless of course you can read Dutch or French or German. A good place to find books is a website called abebooks.com, abebooks.com. I think it's the world's largest secondhand bookstore, book exchange, because ABE stands for American Book Exchange, even though it's German owned right now. But there's tens of thousands of book dealers on abebooks.com, and that's a good place to find guidebooks, travel brochures, and also books written by people who visited these areas. So it's interesting. There are many books written in the 1900s or 1890s, 1900s, 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, written by people who are usually European or American, who might have visited, for example, Bali or Kalimantan or Sumatra, or all of those, and they then wrote about their experiences. And those books are used for quotes. Like if you see the essays at the front of each chapter in my book, I have many quotes, and I've often taken those quotes from books written by people who were visiting different parts of Indonesia at that time. And then there are also magazines like National Geographic magazine. Again, online, you can go online now, and National Geographic has a website, and you can find out, and you can basically use the search program on the National Geographic website and put in Java, for example, and it will tell you every edition of National Geographic ever which had an article about Java. and then I would go onto eBay, and then I would buy those editions of National Geographic. So, but the internet's a powerful search tool, and but yeah, travel books, travel accounts by people who are in the areas. There are some beautiful writers like Louis Couperus, the Dutch writer. He wrote a book, I think 1923, 1924, called Eastwards, and he wrote it in Dutch, but I have an English translation. He wrote beautifully, and I use quite a few of his quotes in the chapters because he just wrote so well. He was famous for good reason. He was a very good writer. And so you just have to be diligent and find materials, be it books or travel guides or travel brochures or magazines from the era. I did not use books published after 1945. I did not. I wanted books that were contemporary, meaning of the time, pada saat itu. Books that were published during the period that I was covering, so 1900 to 1945, with a couple of exceptions. Yeah.
Now we have the last question.
Okay.
It's from Nia Deliana, and she said that I think we need to admit that such postcard on poverty was one of the result of contest between Western modernism and native civilization that was heightening in the production of knowledge in 1900 and 1945. Don't you agree, Pak Scott?
Well, I think that we had what was called the cultivation system or the culture system, the cultural stelsel, sometimes called taman paksa. What's the Indonesian word? The bit forced labor, essentially, and
kerja paksa.
Kerja paksa, yeah, kerja paksa, and that was 1830 something until about 1870, and there's no doubt that the colonial imposition of forced labor caused considerable poverty in certain parts of Java, and the proof of that is the migration patterns. People who normally wouldn't leave their village essentially had to leave their village because by the time the forced labor had been had extracted a certain proportion of the wealth and the resources, there wasn't enough for the villagers. And so then we definitely have, as I mentioned before, the ethical policy from 1901, 3 years after Queen Wilhelmina became queen. There was a recognition, I think, that the Netherlands had just taken too much from Indonesia, but hadn't given enough back. And I think there was a consciousness of poverty as part of the discussion about what do we do in relation to this ethical policy. We can build schools, we can educate children, we can build hospitals, we can help people have a longer lifespan or lower childhood mortality or just help improve the quality of health. But part of that is also overcoming poverty, and I think there was an awareness of that poverty as part of this concern that came out following the ethical policy of how can we really help those who obviously and probably suffered during the difficult decades of the cultural system or the culture system or the cultivation system. I mean, books like Max Havelaar was written. The success of Max Havelaar came out of the fact that people were suffering. It was the Dutch, but it was also the Bupati as well. It wasn't only the Dutch; it was the Bupati as well. But that was very much, I think, part of the consciousness which led to the ethical policy. Eventually, not immediately, but eventually. So there was clearly a consciousness, and hence I think that's why those postcards were published. Yes.
Okay, thank you so much, Pak Scott. And we have we already almost 15 minutes after our schedule,
Okay.
so we are about to close now.
Okay.
Buku menurut saya sendiri, sedikit poin dari diskusi ini, buku telah memainkan peranan penting bagi banyak orang, tidak hanya di Indonesia, tapi di seluruh dunia, terutama di masa pandemi ini, karena membuat kita tetap berpikir positif. Dan Faces of Indonesia, 500 Postcards, 1945, menurut saya adalah salah satu yang memberikan hal ini. Something positive to hold on during this pandemic. Dan kita juga bisa belajar banyak dari diversity yang ditunjukkan, keberagaman kita, identitas asli bangsa Indonesia justru sebelum kemerdekaan yang sekarang ini mungkin sudah banyak mulai melupakan. Thank you again, Periplus, Scott, for beautiful book and for holding this event. And thank you for the audience who have stayed and stay healthy. Puspa, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Devi.
Ms. Devi and Mr. Scott, that was really great. Thank you, Mr. Scott, for answering this question and the excellent presentation. It was a pleasure to have you with us today. Okay, I will announce the winner for the most interesting questions. The winner are Ales Kurniawan, Afkar Aristoteles, Irene Iskandar, Evan Wijaya, and Nia Deliana. For all the selected winner, please write your email address in private chat box to open Periplus Mind. Periplus Open Mind. I'm sorry. Okay. And finally, let me once again remind you to recheck your chat box. You will get a discount 10% off for purchasing Scott books and all history book of Jakarta. This is the end of the event. I wish you all to stay safe and stay healthy. Thank you for all audience for participating in today's discussion book. We hope you have learned and enjoyed this discussion. See you next time.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you,
you.
Pak Judo. Thank you, Ms. Devi. Thank you, Pak Puspa.
Thank you, Pak Scott.
Thank you, Mr.
participants as well.
Scott.
Thanks, Pak
Bye-bye.
Yanuar also. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Pak Judo. Thank you,
Terima
Mr.
kasih Pak
Scott.
Bobi, thank you.
Thank you, Pak Yanuar, Pak Yudo.
Thank you, Pak Yudo. Thank you,
Puspa.
teman-teman semuanya.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Pak. Live ya.
Okay. Thank you, Periplus.
Thank
Udah
you.
boleh live ya. Thanks.
Sukses Pak Yanuar.
Thank you, Pak Hen, supportnya.
Ya. Oke.
Sukses Pak Yan.
Thank you, Pak Indra.
Sukses Pak Yanuar.
Terima kasih, terima kasih.
Mudah-mudahan bukunya tambah laku.
Iya betul. Amin, amin. Iya Pak.
Tadi saya lagi ngedatain para pemenang.
Silakan.
Monggo Pak Hen, itu apa namanya? Kue tanpa ada kopinya, virtual.
Oh iya, saya kopi aja deh.
Bentar, ini udah semua. Oke, thank you semua. Saya close ya.
Oke Pak Yan, selamat sore. Salam sehat.